Thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar is part of a series for the Homeless System Response, and today's webinar is on IDIS.
Hello, my name is Heidi Schulp and I'm from the Cloudburst Group, and I will be presenting on today's webinar, and I'll be joined by...
I'm John Harrison from Apt Associates. There's two learning objectives for today's webinar. The first objective is to learn about the IDIS grants management capabilities for the ESG CARES grants funds to improve each community's ability to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. The second objective is to review the ESG CARES grant funds requirements in IDIS. The agenda for this webinar is to first discuss what is IDIS, then review what information is not included in IDIS, and finally highlight the primary uses for the ESG CARES grant in IDIS. Today's webinar is intended to provide an overview of IDIS and not to go into specific system functionality. The webinar will identify additional materials throughout the presentation to assist individuals in expanding their knowledge base.
IDIS stands for the Integrated Disbursement and Information System, and it is one of HUD's grant management systems. It is an online system where Emergency Solutions Grant Program, ESG recipients provide details to HUD on ESG activities, as well as draw ESG funds from the line of credit. IDIS is the primary grants management system and is HUD's system of record for the Community Planning and Development CPD formula programs, which are the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, Home Investment Partnerships Program, HOME, ESG, Housing for Persons with AIDS, HOPWA, Housing Trust Fund, HTF, and the HOPWA Competitive Program, HOPWA-C. HUD uses the information entered into IDIS by CPD grantees to monitor recipients and to report information on programs to Congress. IDIS has a very specific language, and there are plenty of times where terminology is key. For example, the Emergency Solutions Grant Program is abbreviated ESG, but in IDIS, it is referenced with the acronym HESG. This distinction is made for HESG to refer to the Hearth ESG, whereas the acronym ESG in IDIS refers to the older Emergency Shelter Grants Program. However, for the purposes of this webinar, we will continue to refer to the Emergency Solutions Grants with its more well-known acronym ESG. If referencing a specific IDIS functionality, we'll refer to it as the HESG grant path to assist in avoiding confusion. In addition, IDIS projects within the HESG grant path refer to the entire allocation for a specific plan year, which is very different from how most communities identify a project. In IDIS, an activity refers to a specific component of the ESG program. To further add to confusion, other CPD programs have different project and activity setup requirements, and this can increase confusion for communities that administer more than one CPD program in IDIS.
In order to access IDIS, an individual must have an IDIS username and password. As part of IDIS security procedures, users must log on to the system every 90 days in order to keep their account active. For the ESG program, access is for direct recipients of ESG funds, meaning grantees. Local providers do not typically have access to IDIS. In addition, many HUD headquarters and field office staff have access to IDIS. Here is a link to a resource on how to obtain an IDIS account. In IDIS, a user's specific user privileges can vary from one user to another. Some users are able to create vouchers in IDIS, and other users can only view drawdowns. Each grantee has a local grantee administrator in IDIS with the ability to update existing IDIS user privileges. We are linking another resource that shows how local grantee administrators can update user privileges in IDIS.
Before we highlight the specific information that is entered into IDIS, we wanted to quickly identify a few pieces of information that is not in IDIS. First, the SAGE HMIS reporting repository, otherwise known as SAGE, is a separate system and does not talk to IDIS. The required SAGE Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, otherwise known as the CAPER, and SAGE Quarterly Reports, otherwise known as QPRs, are entered into SAGE separately from IDIS. Here is a link to the SAGE CAPER webinars. In addition, IDIS does not include HMIS client-level data. For more information on HMIS, please refer to the HMIS page on the HUD Exchange, which is full of resources. Earlier in the presentation, we stated that IDIS contains CPD formula-funded programs, as well as the HOPWA competitive program. The Continuum of Care, otherwise known as COC program, does not use IDIS as its HUD system of record, and instead, information and draws are completed in eSnaps. For additional information on eSnaps, please visit the eSnaps page on the HUD Exchange.
The first part of setting up the ESG program in IDIS is for a community to create its 3 to 5 year consolidated plan, which can utilize the ConPlan template that is available in IDIS. For additional information, please review the linked resource for the consolidated plan in IDIS. Moving through the process, each year a grantee submits its annual action plan in IDIS, identifying how a community will utilize its CPD formula funding. This annual action plan is reviewed and approved in IDIS by the local HUD field office. Linked here is a specific resource on how communities can submit a substantial amendment for CARES funding.
As part of the annual action plan, ESG recipients set up one project for the entire grant year. This is included on the AP 35 screen in the annual action plan, which is submitted to HUD in IDIS. We have included a link to a resource that may be assistance to your community if you are having difficulty setting up the HESG Grant Path project in IDIS. For the 2020 grant year, the project will include the fiscal year 2020 formula ESG allocation and both of the ESG CARES grant funds. This is due to a limitation in IDIS that prohibits grantees from setting up more than one HESG Grant Path program project in the same year. To repeat, for the 2020 grant year, there will be only one HESG Grant Path project that will include both the fiscal 2020 ESG funds and the ESG CARES funds.
After creating the one project in grant year 2020, recipients will set up ESG activities in IDIS in the HESG grant path. IDIS limits recipients to setting up one activity per eligible component per grant year. This means that if a recipient is utilizing ESG funds to fund numerous shelter activities, in IDIS, there will be one shelter activity that is made up of all the funds that the recipient has contracted out awards to shelter providers. For 2020, this means that each activity will include both the fiscal year 2020 ESG funds and the ESG CARES funds if the recipient is using both funding sources for that activity component. When setting up activities in IDIS, the ESG CV notice stated that the recipients must describe how the funds will be used to prevent, prepare for, and/or respond to the coronavirus in the activity description in IDIS. Please ensure that your organization's activity descriptions include this requirement.
On this slide, we've included a table to identify the additional ESG CARES activity types that were created by the ESG CV notice. These new activity types are listed in the left column. The right column shows the corresponding IDIS activity category. For example, the ESG CV notice specified that landlord incentives were an eligible cost. If a recipient is working with a local provider who intends to utilize landlord incentives, then these funds would be included in either the homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing activity in IDIS. After IDIS activities have been set up, the next part of the process is to fund the activities in IDIS. When funding an activity in IDIS, this is a way of identifying a signed agreement or obligation with a local provider that is working with your community with ESG funds received directly from your organization. Funding an activity in IDIS may also be referred to as committing funds or obligating funds. In IDIS, ESG grant path activities can only be funded with one grant year of funds. IDIS made the switch to what is called grants-based accounting, beginning with a 2011 Emergency Solutions Grant Program funds. However, because the 2020 grant year is very unique in that communities will receive two 2020 grants from HUD. One grant will be the recipient's fiscal 2020 grant, and the second grant will be the recipient's ESG CARES grant. For the 2020 grant year activities only, recipients will be funding activities with more than one grant because both grants are placed in the 2020 year. For the HESG grant path, ESG recipients identify the specific organization that has a direct agreement with the ESG recipient organization for a specific ESG activity component. This is very different from how other CPD programs set up activity funding in IDIS. For example, say that a recipient has signed an agreement with a local provider for both fiscal 2020 and ESG CARES funds to provide emergency shelter operations. In IDIS, at the activity funding level, the recipient that will identify the local provider for both the fiscal 2020 and the ESG CARES funds. It is extremely important that recipients set up activity funding correctly in IDIS. Identifying the specific subrecipient with whom the recipient has a direct contract increases the data validity in IDIS and provides HUD with a better understanding of the local partners in each community. After funding activities in IDIS, the next part of the process is to create drawdowns or vouchers for eligible expenses. When creating a voucher in IDIS, a user will need the privilege to do so. Then, when it comes in time to creating a voucher, the voucher is created for the activity and subrecipient. Back to our previous example, where a recipient had a contract signed with a local shelter provider for both fiscal 2020 and ESG CARES funds. Let's say for this specific example, the shelter provider submitted a request for reimbursement and provided the necessary documentation to the recipient. This specific reimbursement request was only for ESG CARES funds. In IDIS, the recipient would create the voucher for the 2020 shelter activity and would be very careful to draw the funds from the ESG CARES grant and not from the ESG fiscal 2020 grant. When creating vouchers in IDIS, it is a two-step process. First, one user creates the voucher, then a second user must approve the voucher. The same user cannot create and approve the same voucher. Additionally, there are other things to keep in mind when creating and approving vouchers in IDIS. First, vouchers in IDIS cannot be revised to other grant years or grants. For the 2020 grant year, this is extremely important as fiscal 2020 ESG vouchers cannot be revised to ESG CARES grant funds and vice versa. Therefore, recipients must be very careful when creating vouchers in IDIS that the activity, subrecipient, and grant selected on the voucher is correct. In order to avoid situations where the recipients wait until the end of a program to reimburse themselves by drawing funds from IDIS, ESG recipients are required to draw funds quarterly from IDIS. We recommend drawing much more frequently than that. Finally, ESG recipients must reimburse subrecipients within 30 days of receiving a complete invoice package.
We recognize that sometimes vouchers do need to be revised. However, those revisions in IDIS can only take place within the same grant. For example, from one subrecipient to another, or from one activity to another, but those revisions can again only take place within the same grant. Here are links to 2 resources that can provide additional information on how to revise vouchers in IDIS.
One last reminder about creating vouchers in IDIS, but this is one way that HUD can track recipients' progress towards meeting the expenditure deadlines provided in the ESG CV notice for ESG Cares grants. Recipients must expend 20% of their total ESG Cares award by September 30th, 2021, 80% of the total ESG Cares award by March 31st, 2022, and 100% of the total ESG Cares award by September 30th, 2022. IDIS contains numerous canned reports that recipients can utilize to help track the status of funding and draws. These reports have been updated to include the ESG Cares grants. The first report is the PR91 ESG Financial Summary Report. This report provides a quick snapshot of a specific grant year and provides the funded and drawn amount for each activity. The report is best utilized as a PDF document. In addition, the report provides a listing of the funded and drawn amounts for each subrecipient identified on the activity funding level in IDIS for the specific grant. The PR91 cannot be run in IDIS as a combined report for the fiscal 2020 ESG allocation and ESG Cares grants. Instead, the report has a separate version for the ESG Cares grants. The PR93 ESG Risk Status Report lists risk indicators in IDIS that help ESG recipients identify if they are on track to meet their obligation and expenditure deadlines. More information is available on these reports as well as others in the ESG IDIS manual, as well as the link reference on using IDIS reports for financial management.
At the end of program year, recipients submit 2 capers. There is one holistic caper submitted in IDIS for all CPD formula programs. We've included a link for a webinar on how to complete the 2020 caper in IDIS. Additionally, ESG recipients complete a separate caper in SAGE. We've linked to an entire series of training for ESG recipients on completing the SAGE caper.
As we begin to wrap up, we wanted to specifically highlight 4 great resources available for ESG recipients as they navigate through IDIS. The first is the ESG IDIS manual. This manual goes through the step-by-step process of creating activities, funding activities, drawing funds, revising vouchers, and utilizing reports in IDIS. There is a new section added to the manual that covers the specific considerations for the ESG Cares grants in IDIS. There are lots of screenshots and resources identified in the manual. As a recommendation, do not print out a copy of the manual, but check back on the HUD Exchange and access the manual there. Just in case there's an IDIS update and an updated manual is available, we don't want you referencing an out-of-date version. Next up are the specific IDIS frequently asked questions. These questions provide quick answers to common questions on IDIS. The third resource is the IDIS ESG Cares webinar that was conducted in October 2020. This webinar includes an IDIS demonstration and concludes with a question and answer session. The slides and video recording are available on the HUD Exchange. The final resource we wanted to highlight is the Ask a Question feature on the HUD Exchange. You can submit a question there and receive a written response. If you have an IDIS specific question, when presented with a drop-down menu asking you what your question pertains to, select IDIS from the drop-down menu.
Outside of IDIS resources, we wanted to highlight other great resources to check out to assist your community in administering its ESG grants. Finally, thank you for attending this webinar. We hope that this overview was a helpful introduction to IDIS.